Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about a landmark historical event, a very tragic event in the minds of many people. A Supreme Court justice ruling that colleges can no longer take race into consideration when admitting students. Basically, an overturn of affirmative action cases, especially the 2003 case of Gutler versus Bollinger, which ruled, hey Lisa, what's going on? Which ruled that states, that colleges could take race into consideration when admitting certain students, especially when it comes to these historically uh, colleges that have historically practiced discrimination with regards to race, such as the one in here, the University of South Carolina, which is one of um, the two institutions that are for debate here. And this, of course, the overturn of affirmative action. They've been talking about overturning affirmative action rulings since it basically started in 1978 as a way to level the playing field with regards to racism in this country. Because, like I said in another video, the reason why there are HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, is because these historically white colleges um, never wanted to admit students of color until they were forced to. Ironically, the opponents of so-called affirmative action or these initiatives to level the playing field, ironically used the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65, plus the 14th Amendment, which states that you cannot discriminate on the basis of color, race, or ethnicity as a basis to say that these universities, by not basically showing preference to students of color, but basically considering the historical experiences of students of color first when admitting them. See, that was the always, in my opinion, that was the fallacious argument that conservatives would always come with, that these affirmative action admissions were always unfair, that they were always discriminating against like white or Asian students. But really, that wasn't really the case. What they were taking into consideration is economic biases, historical biases, um, especially historical biases, because people would come with the argument, as people often did, well, the Asian American kids might come from economically disadvantaged background. White students, certain white students, depending on their demographics and where they live, might come from historically disadvantaged um, backgrounds. So economically disadvantaged backgrounds, not historically, or maybe even historically, like if they come from Appalachia or other poor parts of the South. But what they're missing is um, that's different with the Asian students or and poor white students and the African American students was the poor white students or the Asian students did not face the historical discrimination that the African American students and in some states the Latino students often did. I'm talking about legal discriminations. They were not admitted into these universities, even if they did really well. Sure, you had rare examples, such as like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first Harvard graduate of African descent. But in most cases, the reason why black people had to, again, set up their own colleges and universities was because white universities were not admitting them. We know about Jim Crow, we know about these racist policies, especially um, in Southern colleges, but that was even the case in Ivy League schools, in Princeton, and Yale, and Harvard, which is the second case that they took into consideration in this instance. It was the University of North Carolina and it was Harvard, the two that they took into consideration here. And This is why this existed. Because I always say that the way you have to look at it in every instance in this country when it comes to race, especially like I said with African Americans, is you got to look at it like a race that you run, right? Say white people got like a 200, 300 year head start. So you can't all of a sudden make the laws fair in 1964 and 65 and in that short amount of time expect everything to be okay. We all have the same opportunities now, but we don't all have the same opportunities, because what about the hundreds of years before that, when the white people had the unfair advantage, and poor disadvantaged white people economically, and rich white people as well, just on the basis of their skin, white privilege. What about that? I mean, you can't just disregard 200 and 300 years of history, right? Um, like 300 years of slavery, and then after that, another 70 years of Jim Crow and unfair practices, in this country. So you can't just disregard history. But that's what they want to do. That's what these conservatives want to do. They want to act like it was always fair and balanced. It was always equal. Hell, they have a channel on TV that says that they're fair and balanced. Meanwhile, they're the most biased channel on cable news TV. They're never honest about their intentions, about what they want to do. Um, Two presidents weighed in about this situation. President Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, and former President Donald Trump. And predictably so, Donald Trump said it was a great day for America, and Barack Obama said that it was a terrible day for America, that if were it not for some of these laws, that he and Michelle would have not been given a fair shot in this country, and that's pretty much true. Now, his detractors going to say, "Well, of course, see, it's an affirmative action hire," which implies that he's less intelligent or less worthy than. But again, not taking historical circumstances into consideration, and the 200, 300 year head start that people like Donald Trump's family had, who comes from legacy and generational wealth, that Barack Obama and his family and Michelle Robinson Obama and her family did not have, because of race, because of discrimination. What I mean? As a matter of fact, if you just hear them all speak, you would know that Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are way more intelligent, way more articulate, and actual people of intelligence and merit than somebody like a Donald Trump. But of course, what this does, as Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina judge on the Supreme Court, said, what this does is this rolls back legislation, because this now opens the door for other universities to go back to the way it was during those heavily discrimination days, and now they'll say, well, we don't have to admit certain disadvantaged students into our program, despite how smart they are. They could now roll back the clock, and those African American students or even Latino students will be at the back of the line now, because unless the government forced their hand, they wouldn't have done it anyway. The history in this country has been that, unfortunately, the federal government and things like the Supreme Court and executive legislation, executive orders, and the government, the federal government especially, has had to force um, racial fairness and racial equity in this country. They've had to force it. They've had to come in and use the heavy hand of the federal government to make things equal and fair. Because if we're not for the federal government doing that in all these cases, including the 14th Amendment, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 65, including even the end to even slavery, were not for the federal government stepping in and using quote unquote federal overreach, we wouldn't have had a fair and equal society because the state governments and the local governments and the local courts would have discriminated against people on the basis of race, including in universities. And the universities would have discriminated, and the local courts, the local state courts would have upheld that because, I mean, let's just face it, conservatives argue for smaller government and less intrusiveness by the Supreme Court because the courts and the laws and the rule of law make things fair for people whose historical circumstances have been that things have often been unfair. You know what I'm saying? When they step in as an arbitrator, the federal government, these states have to act. But without that barrier, without the barrier of the courts as a weapon, the states and the universities don't have to act on behalf of people that they can discriminate against. That barrier is removed. That threat is removed. So this is really sad. You know what I mean? They're acting in the name of justice and fairness, but it's duplicitous doublespeak. They're saying what they're saying, but they're not saying what they mean. What they mean is that we're all going to be fair now, right? It's just like separate but equal, the separate but equal clause that was inherited in the 1894 case of Plessy versus Ferguson that established Jim Crow in the first place. They said, "Oh, it's going to be fair. Don't worry about it. You know, we're not going to discriminate on the basis of race or color." Meanwhile, yeah, there was two separate schools, one for blacks and one for whites. But the one that was for black people was severely inferior in quality and in education and in wealth and resources, while the one for white students was superior in all of that. So the outcomes were not the same. And the outcomes were not the same, not because one group of students was less intelligent than another group of students, but because their circumstances were not the same, because their resources were not the same, and a lot of times because the local and state governments worked in concert with the courts to make it so that it wasn't the same. You know what I mean? Let's not all pretend that we all started off on an equal playing field because we all did not. I mean, centuries of racism and Jim Crow proved that. Again, I keep saying the same thing because I cannot hammer this point home enough. Conservatives are looking at it disingenuously as, oh, a big, huge victory for fairness and equality. How? When these laws were put in place to us, these laws and these court rulings were put in place to establish fairness and equality. Sure, in an ideal, perfect world, we would like for students to be judged on their intelligence, their acumens, their credentials. But we don't live in an ideal, perfect world. We live in a country that is marred and with racism and marred with prejudice. You know what I mean? Where these administrators, these college administrators, would take their own bias into consideration because they did in the past. So what makes people think that they wouldn't now? It's just like with the police. People say, "Oh well, you know, the police are just doing their job, enforcing law and order." Are they though? You know what I'm saying? Are they? When they carry their own biases that are created and informed by the historical circumstances in the society in which they live, which is completely race dominant and race obsessive and completely inculcated with this idea that um, whites are superior to black people, that black people are less intelligent and black people are less deserving. So what they'll do is they'll manipulate the circumstances to make it seem as though that is the case by purposely not admitting African American students because they don't meet up to those credentials, not taking into consideration that African American students and often Latino students, especially those that come from immigrant backgrounds, may have vastly different circumstances, not just economically, but socially and culturally. Just like when they talk about crime statistics and how crime statistics skew heavily negative in favor of people of color, never taking into consideration economics or historical disadvantages. Lisa was saying that she saw in the news that an Asian guy, when they were talking about it, this Asian guy was um, really advocating for against affirmative action because again, Asians unfortunately have been the victims, the real heavy victims of these quotas because although Asians are a visible minority in this country and they have faced historical discriminations um, in society and even in academia, they have not faced the same historical um, discriminations in African Americans, and they haven't really they haven't faced at all the disenfranchisement that African Americans have faced. No other group has really faced it because, as Lisa and others have pointed out, and I've even pointed this out in some of my videos, Asians arrived here already with their culture intact, already with their family structure intact, already with their traditions intact, already with their self worth intact. None of that was ever attacked. They weren't enslaved. They weren't the property of other Americans. Yeah, they were indentured, but the indentureship again is different. And they all weren't indentured. Most of the Asian Americans arrived here after indentureship. Not every Asian American, not every Chinese person was involved with building the railroad. Not every Japanese person was involved in harvesting sugarcane in Hawaii. Not every East Indian was involved in indentureship in the Caribbean or in um, East Africa or anywhere else, Imperial Valley in California. Most most Asian Americans, no matter what type of Asian they are, arrived here already uh, after like 1965 when the immigration laws changed in this country with regards to Asian Americans. We know they had the Gentleman's Agreement. We know they had the Chinese Exclusion Act and things of that nature. But still, they didn't face the kind of chattel slavery and uh, centuries of legal battles and legal and social barriers like eminent domain, like redlining, blockbusting. They didn't face their communities being destroyed like in the Tulsa riots or in Elaine Arkansas or Wilmington, North Carolina or Ocoee, Florida, any of those, or Rosewood. They didn't face that kind of violence and that kind of discrimination and that kind of hatred and that kind of disenfranchisement. I mean, they might have faced some of it to some degree in some states, yes, but not overall. We cannot compare the experience of African Americans to the experience of any other group in this country. So, yes, because of their situation and the way they perform at a high academic level, they weren't considered in these affirmative action quotas in the same way. And a lot of times, when colleges admitted people, an Asian student, an African American student would do the same, uh, be on the same level academically, and they would consider the African American student first because of those reasons I stated above. And unfortunately, the Asian American student would not probably get in, but they would get into other universities, so it wasn't such a big deal. You know, you know what I mean? Lisa's on the chat. Lisa, would you like to add anything to what I'm saying here? Do I think this will go into effect really soon? Uh, no, I don't. I think other states will fight this, much like Roe v. Wade. Um, what this goes into, and what I want to stress here, is the importance, guys, of presidential elections. I said this in the Roe v. Wade video, and I'm stressing this again. Please, I know, like when you look at guys like Biden, and you look at, because I did it, so I know what you guys are going through. When you look at guys like Biden, who appears to be incompetent, Trump, who appears to be a buffoon, or you might look at other candidates coming in the future in 2024 or 2028 or uh, you know whenever, like 2031 or whenever you vote in the near or distant future, you have to take into consideration that it does matter. You might look like it doesn't matter, or every 4 years they rotate, every 8 years they rotate. But remember, it's the president who appoints these Supreme Court justices and hold your future in their hands. And Elisa is bringing up a good point, not just the presidential elections, but also the primary and the state elections. So you might look at it like it doesn't really matter, and you might trivialize it like, oh, well, who really cares anyway? It doesn't affect my life, right? But it does affect your life, or it might not affect your life primarily because you not might want to go to college, but it affects the lives of your children, your grandchildren. You know what I mean? Because conservatives understand this. This is why a lot of conservatives, they didn't mind. A lot of them didn't like Trump. Trump wasn't an uber conservative. He wasn't socially conservative. He wasn't Christian. He paid lip service to Christianity. He paid lip service to the things that they love, the things that they cherish, and the things that they hold dear. You know what I mean? He did, but he wasn't like a George Bush type evangelical or like a Ted Cruz or like even they kind of like Ron DeSantis even more. But I guarantee you, if Ron DeSantis and Trump participate in the primary and whomever wins, they're going to vote for whoever wins. They're not going to be fooled and say, well, okay, my guy, like we did it. And I include myself in this. We say, oh well, our guy didn't win, Bernie Sanders, and we don't like Hillary. She's not liberal enough. So she doesn't meet up to our high ass unrealistic standards as far as what we want. She doesn't give us everything we want. So we're gonna throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we're just gonna say fuck it and either not vote for somebody who can never win like Jill Stein, or out of a spite vote for Trump to punish the Democratic Party. That's a bad decision to make. Or like Lisa is saying, a lot of people do. They pay attention to the presidential election because of the way the media hypes it, but they never pay attention to the primaries or the local elections. Sometimes, as was the case a couple of weeks ago, Lisa herself told me that she was out with friends and she didn't even know that they were voting because the media doesn't make a big deal of these local elections, but these things matter. You know what I mean? We live in a democracy. What's the point of living in a democracy if you never voice your opinion? You know what I'm saying? So if you never say anything, of course, things are never going to happen the way you want. And then when things like this happen, and conservatives, like I said, they don't care. They might not like Trump. They might not like DeSantis. They might not like who is going to be the guy or who might be the guy or the woman. In the case of Nikki Haley as their candidate, but their asses will get up and they will vote for that person, even if they don't like that person, because they understand that um, that these little decisions help affect the big picture. And they've been pushing for years and years to turn back the clock to the 1950s with regards to race, with regards to gender, with regards to LGBT rights. They've been pushing for this and pushing for this. And finally, now they're beginning to make headway. You know what I mean? Because us on the left, we're no longer caring. We're dropping out. We're being apathetic. We're saying it doesn't really matter. We're saying, what's the point of this lesser than two evils thing? You know what I mean? We're buying into this it don't really matter rhetoric. And when you buy into that, and when you no longer give a shit, the other side gives a shit and they start beating you. Because think about it this way, guys. What happens in a fight? If I'm fighting you, right, and and I'm beating your ass, and I'm beating your ass like the left was since the 1960s to the right wing, and they were winning a whole bunch of legal battles, a whole bunch of social battles. They managed to change the entire trajectory of the culture, both legally and socially, since the 1960s. And they were winning and winning and winning, and then all of a sudden, like since like 2010, the left just started dropping out and just saying, "Oh fuck it, who cares?" Right? Because they figured they won and they got lazy. Now they've gotten lazy or they've gotten apathetic, and now the right is starting to punch back, and the right is starting to win because the left is no longer in the fight. The left is no longer in the game. You know what I mean? Because they think they've got it in the bag because oh, Roe v. Wade's never going nowhere. These affirmative action cases are never going nowhere. Um, Oberfield versus Hodges ain't going nowhere, so it doesn't really matter. We're winning anyway. They're not winning. You're losing anyway. Uh, Lisa says, will this affect HSBCUs, colleges, funding for them? Do you think applications for HSBCUs will go up now? Yes, I do. I do. Because one of the unfortunate, and you hear black nationalists all the time, black nationalists, Pan Africanists, whatever operative word you want to use, black conscious people, especially like Umar Johnson and people like this, they will often make the argument that integration was bad for the black community. That things that black people had, we're talking about colleges here, so Lisa brought up HBCUs, that they were thriving before integration, and that when integration happened, they it hurt um, it hurt the black community because things that were uniquely black and pro-black and for the black community suffered because black students said, "Well, before I didn't have the option of a white school to go to, but now I have the white school, so I think the white man's ice is colder, as the saying goes. So I'm gonna go over here that something that I consider superior versus something that I consider inferior. I had to go to the inferior thing because I had no other choice. But now I have choices, now I have options, and I'll go to the superior thing. And unfortunately, that sort of mindset hurt historically black colleges and universities because now that um, high academically performing black students could get into the white schools, they chose the white schools over the black schools. And this nearly put HBCUs out of business, just like it did the quote unquote Negro leagues in baseball. That's exactly the same thing that happened in baseball. Once baseball became integrated in 1947, people were like, "Oh well, the best and the brightest baseball players could go over to the white leagues, the white major leagues now. They don't need to go over to the black leagues, and the black leagues went out of business." And that almost happened to historically black colleges and universities. And that was one of the downfalls and the pitfalls of integration, as many of these have pointed out. So, and a good unintended consequence of this, historically black colleges and universities might get more applicants now of the best and the brightest students um, among the African American community because it was almost like a brain drain of the African American community. The best and the brightest men and women were not going to historically black colleges and universities anymore. Almost nobody was. They were uh, choosing the white schools. So I do think, Lisa, that this would be good for historically black colleges and universities. Yes, I do. Spelman, Fisk, um, Howard, places like this. I always thought that the HSBCUs were more fun anyway. Because I grew up in the Cosby era, and even though Hillman, the alma mater of the Huxtables, wasn't a real college, it was based on Spelman College. I think a combination of Spelman and Morehouse. And the late 80s and early 90s seemed like, they made historically black colleges and universities seem cooler and fun. I mean, you saw a lot of people back in the day with historically black colleges and sweaters and apparel, especially when a different, like I said, the Cosby Show in a different world were in the air, made it seem like it was cool to go to a black college. You know, you know, you never saw Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, or Yale, or Berkeley promoted as cool, really, but you saw the black colleges promoted as cool. So I used to think when I was little, damn, it'd be cooler to go to one of those schools than a white college. You know what I mean? Especially a different world. A different world. Sorry, guys, a lot of my perspective does come from television, but a different world made it made it seem like, damn, these historically black colleges were the place to be. You know what I mean? Made college seem cool. And that was one of the good things about Bill Cosby. Several bad things about Bill, but one of the good things about Bill was that he made education seem like it was a cool thing. So I think this might have a good effect on them. But I do think states will fight this tooth and nail. I don't think they'll take it lying down. And Clarence Thomas, predictably, he he came out and said that it was a good thing. It seems like he's like another candidate. Expect Candace Owens to say this was a good thing too. She'll say that this is a step in the right direction. I know her. She'll say this is a step in the right direction for equality under the law. Again, not taking historical circumstances into consideration, not taking the racism of college administrators into consideration, just completely ignoring the facts on the ground and just completely, like Clarence Thomas, siding with everything that white people say, you know, lockstep. She's already been voted as the number one white supremacist on the internet. I mean, you have actual white supremacists, actual white people that are on the internet promoting this garbage, but even they are not as bad, according to this index, as she is. She is so good at parroting these white talking points that she's actually become better than the actual white people that created these lame talking points. You know, it's really saying something when a black puppet like her is better at saying the things that white people used to say than she is. That's like a weird reversal of cultural appropriation in a way. You know what I'm saying? She's become, in a sense, like the Eminem of of the white racist world. She's now better at doing what they did than the originators that started doing what she's doing. You know what I mean? Ben Shapiro doesn't have to say it anymore. Michael Knowles doesn't have to say it anymore. Matt Walsh doesn't have to say it anymore. She'll just say it for them. You know what I mean? And they feel comforted when they hear Clarence Thomas say it, or Candace Owens say it, or Brandon Tatum say it, or Thomas Sowell say it, because they feel like, damn, I couldn't say it because I'm a white guy, and how does it will look bad. You know what I mean? It would look bad for my image if I said it. But since she's a black woman or he's a black man, he could say what I wanted to say, but I didn't have the balls to say. Okay, Lisa's saying she's gonna put what Candace said about this situation on my Facebook Messenger. Okay. Oh wow. Okay. Predictably, she says, "What a great day for Asian Americans who have endured flagrant educational discrimination because they do everything right. So glad they will finally get into schools that you deserve based on the hard work you put in." Okay, and then she goes on to say, "It even harms black people. It purports to help who are relegated to academic probation for having artificially mismatched in the schools they're placed into." Okay, basically what she's saying here is that again it's good for Asians because Asians were an unfair casualty of this attempt to create historical to right the historical wrongs that they didn't have anything really to do with. And like I said, they were unfairly discriminated against, just a part of life. They weren't really discriminated against because they were still getting in the higher numbers to these prestigious Ivy League universities. I mean, come on. It wasn't like you would go to these places and they were completely devoid of Asian people. You know what I mean? Like you would go to these places and they still had a high number of Asian people, a high number of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Indian, Pakistani, all these types of Asians, East and South Asian. You know what I mean? Not really Southeast Asian because again, Southeast Asians, Southeast Asians have had a lot of the historical um, barriers placed in front of them. Filipinos, Cambodians, Laotians, as African Americans and Mexican American students have. So, I mean, what about them? you, you know what I'm saying? And then she goes on to use the reverse argument. Oh, it harms black people because, um, hold on, Lisa send another message. She said they might succeed if they were placed in schools that of their own intellectual merit. And Matt Walsh, another peanut gallery motherfucker, says even aside from the fact that affirmative action is explicitly racist, it also is disastrous on its own terms. These have these have these have made every intellectual institution less effective, less efficient, less competent. Okay, basically, okay, Lisa, I read it all. I read all I want to read. What Matt Walsh and can't. No, it's all right, Lisa. What they're basically saying here is that black students are less intelligent. To sum it up, they are indicating that black students are less intelligent. They're running with the old race and IQ debates that got Stefan Molyneux kicked off. Uh, well, I don't know about all social media platforms. I don't know if he's on Rumble or anything. But Stefan Molyneux, the South African Canadian white supremacist, used to make these sort of race and IQ arguments. And for a while, Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin and all these sort of people. This is an old argument, an old book back in the '90s, The Bell Curve, purported this theory. The idea that African American students, or African American, not just students, but African American people, black people, not just African Americans, but black people as a whole, as a race, are less intelligent. That white and Asian people scored the highest IQ, whites the second. I mean, Ashkenazi Jews, which they consider different than whites, scored the second highest, and white Caucasians scored the third highest, and so on and so forth down the line. You know, Sephardic Jews, Middle Eastern people, and black people, black Americans at the second to last bottom, and black Africans at the last bottom. And this is what white supremacy runs with. So these two are parroting the same white supremacist talking points that we've been hearing that have been completely debunked because IQ tests have proven to be culturally biased, basically. You know what I mean? And circumstantial because you go back to the early 1900s, early 1800s, even Thomas Sowell, one of the biggest conservative advocates of all time, pointed this out in his book, in a lot of his writings. Some people like it, some people don't. Black rednecks and white liberals, one of the people that Candace champions, even he says that IQ tests are not explicitly based on genetics, but based on cultural and environmental factors. You know, and like Sergeant Willie Pete often points out, Sergeant Willie Pete here on YouTube often points out, and has been pointing out back even when he debunked Stefan Molyneux, what he says is that the black condition and the reason he's a very highly intellectual black YouTuber, SWP. Some women might not agree with what he says based on his arguments against feminism, but that's an issue aside. But even he says what what causes the lack of academic performance in the black community is not genetics, or it's not necessarily even a defective culture like Dinesh D'Souza or Thomas Sowell want to put out. But what it causes is prolonged exposure to poverty. The prolonged exposure to poverty has devalued education in a lot of young African American kids' minds. So they don't focus as much on it because they don't feel the need to it. They don't see the fruits of their labor being produced. They don't see any results from it. So they neglect it and they focus their attentions on other things. You know, whether it be the culture of hip hop and the culture of music or the underground narco street drug culture. You know, they put their attention into other things because they see the fruits of their labor being produced in those other things, whereas they don't see it in academics because of racism and because of the barriers placed in front of it. And like you said, prolonged exposure to poverty, which makes perfect sense as to why it is. And that the culture, the anti intellectual culture, and the results you're seeing in the IQ test are products of that, products of the prolonged exposure to poverty and the less fruitful results. So it's like, for example, if I'm a farmer, right? And I'm a I farm, and every day I go out there and I plant those crops as diligently as my other fellow farmers do. And I plant them and I plant them for years and years. And they never yield any fruits. After a while, am I going to continue to plant those crops, or am I just going to say fuck it and let me move to an urban environment and focus my attentions and my energies on something else different? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do because that's a natural human tendency. So people like SWP, they argue that that's the cause why rappers and things, rappers and underground people in the streets, like say the famous gangsters like Big Beach or Larry Hoover, famous whatever gangsters, you might see they appear to be geniuses. You know what I mean? They appear to be really entrepreneurial, like really great intellectual minds, but you don't see them in the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons or the Fortune 500 companies because they were shut out from those opportunities. And even today, as all things appear to be equal, they don't. Their efforts don't bear the same fruits, so they focus their attentions in other avenues where they do appear to be successful, which is entertainment, sports, or the underground criminal community. And that's what it is. It's not genetics. You know what I mean? It's not even culture. The culture is a product of that of the historical circumstances, the prolonged exposure to poverty. It's not a defectiveness in the people that's genetic. Because if that were the case, then you would have no black geniuses. You would have no uh, black greatness or black excellence. You know what I mean? If that were the case, you know what I mean. So that's obviously not the case. And let's just face it. Although there are some biological realities in race, and there are some differences, outward differences like height or maybe bone density or whatever the case may be, really, in reality, race is really just a social construct because in several societies, people that may appear black in some societies may appear white in other societies, as we see with Latin America, for example. You know what I mean? So, yeah, it was 1994 was the book The Bell Curve that really got people talking about this race and IQ discrepancy. That again has been debunked within real science. It's not like one of those things like, oh, gender is a social construct. No, race is has been mutable over the centuries. We talked about this in the Whoopi Goldberg video, and how in Europe people thought of different religions as racial groups. Even in places like England and Ireland, they thought of Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. Even here in America, in the mid 1900s, when the Irish were first immigrating here, you saw this in the movie Gangs of New York, where they would think of the Irish as a separate race from the Anglo-Saxon Protestant whites. You know what I mean? So each and every generation, more and more people are included into this arbitrary white category. I mean, years ago, Italians weren't thought of as whites. Greeks weren't thought. Read the book, The History of White People by Neil Irving Painter. It's a very good book. And in this book, she's telling it that in ancient times, in antiquity, groups like the Greeks and the Romans didn't really think of themselves necessarily as white people, but as yellow people. Like when Aristotle first created the racial categories, they thought of themselves as the people that we think of today. They thought of themselves as the yellow people. They didn't really think of themselves as the same group with the Scythians and the Northern Europeans, for example. The Romans with the Germanics and the Greeks with the Scythians, they thought of them as white, and they thought of them as savage, and they thought of themselves as yellow and more civil. I mean, yellow and more civilized. So the same way, my point is, if they were making those arguments in antiquity, Aristotle was making those arguments, or Tacitus, the Roman historian, was making those arguments, he would then make the argument that the people that we perceive of as white, the Northern Europeans, the Anglo Saxons, the Germanics, were less intelligent, had lesser IQs, and were genetically deficient in the same way that the racists today are making it about black people. He would have made it about the people we perceive today as white. And the Greeks and the Romans didn't think of themselves as white people. They thought themselves as something completely different from white people. You see what I'm saying? So who and who isn't white changes over the years. At one time, like I said, the Irish weren't considered white, the Italians weren't considered white. Some people still don't even consider Jewish people, even Ashkenazi Jewish people whose origins are in Eastern Europe. They came to America from Eastern Europe. They went to Israel from Eastern Europe. Even they come from Eastern Europe. Some people, especially white supremacists, they don't consider them white either. They consider them as Middle Eastern Semitic. Some Jews don't consider themselves as white either. While legally, in the census on documents, Middle Eastern and North African people are considered as part of the Caucasian race only when they need to boost their numbers and they need to strengthen their numbers. They put them as part of the Caucasian race. But socially, we know that Middle Eastern people and North African people, MENA people, are not considered white. We know that to be true. But they're considered that legally because they want to bolster their race and they also want to make historical arguments uh, that people, the great civilizations during antiquity, like Mesopotamia and Egypt, were an extension of white Western civilization. But only when they want to make those arguments. When they want to make the arguments that they're distinct from Western civilization, such as the Quran burning case that happened with the guy in Iraq, they say, okay, we're a white civilization and we're superior, and this is brown civilization and it's inferior. So when they want the Arabs to be white, they're white. When they don't want the Arabs to be, when they want to make the argument that the Arabs aren't white, then they're not white. So sometimes they make them as white as Leonardo DiCaprio. Sometimes in their mind, when they want to make the argument, they're as black as Wesley Snipes. Depending on the argument they're making, their perception shifts. Like again, Sergeant Willie Pete pointed to in one of his videos. He said that when white supremacists make the argument that slavery was equal, like they'll make the argument that, oh, well, both races were enslaved. Black people enslaved white people and white people enslaved black people. They'll point to the Moors and the Barbary Coast Wars of the early 1800s, and they'll say, well, see, the Barbary Coast pirates enslaved white Americans too, right? In the wars in the early 1800s, which they did. And they'll say, well, see, the Barbary Coast pirates were North Africans and they were black. When in reality, by that time, we know that historic academics were considering North Africans as white. So it was really white on white slavery. It wasn't black on white slavery. And we know that white supremacists today consider North Africans and Middle Easterners to be white. We went down this road with the Cleopatra freaking video where we had an hour-long discussion with an Israeli person about whiteness. You know what I'm saying? So really, this racial shit is a social construct. They let in who they want to let in when they want to let in. They let out who they want to let out when they want to let them out. When they want to bolster their argument and bolster their numbers, they let them in. And when they want to put down those specific groups, they let them out. Same with Latinos. Sometimes they'll include Latinos as part of the Caucasian grander race by bolstering their numbers and forcing them to put down the white category on census and official applications. Other times they'll say that Latinos, especially Caribbean Latinos, have more in common with black people, especially when they want to bolster the crime numbers and the crime statistics of blacks in the black people in the inner cities. Uh, Lisa is saying the Supreme Court's going to piss off this new generation. First Roe v. Wade, now this. Exactly. Exactly. So they're trying to turn back the clock to the 1950s. So Trump is out, but Trump's legacy still is lingering. What Trump did, the damage that Trump did by putting in like people like Amy Coney Barrett at the last minute, or Brett Kavanaugh, still lingering. It's still having an effect on not only women, and affirmative action affects women because who stood to gain most from affirmative action? Not really racial minorities, but more so women. Because what the Civil Rights Act did, that I say was bad, that the Civil Rights Act lumped every disadvantaged minority group together. You know what I'm saying? Women, white women, African Americans, Latinos, all these other disadvantaged, historically marginalized groups, and all didn't have the same circumstances. You know what I mean? But if they all benefit from this, this could sometimes overshadow what it was initially intended for, which was to right the wrongs of racial injustice in this country, specifically and only to African Americans, because African Americans were the ones who suffered these historical injustices, not other groups. I mean, Latinos to a degree, of course, 1954, Hernandez versus Texas, of course, and 1950, um, I think it was 54 too, Mendez versus Manchester in California, which struck down segregationist laws with regards to Mexican Americans, whose situation Mexican Americans, again, was very unique because um, in the 1830s, when the Southwest became part of the United States uh, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, excuse me, the 1840s, after 1848, the Mexican American War, tons of um, was formerly Mexican citizens became part of the United States and became the first generation of Mexican Americans. Legally, Mexican Americans were considered as white, but socially they were not. And state laws being that they were in places like Texas and California, there was heavy discrimination against uh, Mexican Americans, and there were some racist segregationist laws struck down in regards to them. But overall, in a general sense, no other racial group faced the level of legal discrimination that African Americans face. So these affirmative action laws were not put in place for white women. They were not put in place for other ethnic minority groups. They were only put in place for African Americans because African Americans, ADOS, FBA, as Tariq Nasheed likes to say, were the only groups that really suffered heavily these historic um, discriminations. Like I said, in some states Mexicans did, but I'm talking about in all of the other states generally, and for a longer period of time. Because, like I said, 1848, uh, those after the Mexican American War, that's when those states became part of the United States. African Americans been suffering legal discrimination for longer than that, uh, 1619 and even longer, with the start of the first importation of African American slaves slash indentured labor. And so you can't really compare the two situations in that. And with white women, yeah, white women as women suffered legal discrimination, but let's just face facts. A lot of white women, especially in the South, they were against the 19th Amendment anyway. And a lot of them, like is often said, were the facilitators of male white supremacy. I mean, that's just what it is. It is what it is. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Peace out. Love you guys.